So on Instagram the other day, I got this question in relation to filmmaker / hiker Kraig Adams, which says, I was wondering what you thought on his gear. Never any boots, no GPS map, practically no base layers or emergency clothing. I love his videos, but would it be wise to copy him or take more gear? So yeah, great question. When does ultralight hiking become ultra dangerous and ultra irresponsible? So there's definitely a feeling among some members of the hiking community that maybe going ultralight without the necessary safety equipment is a little bit irresponsible. So in this video, I'm going to unpack that a little bit. I want to share with you some questions that you can ask yourself in that moment when you're packing your gear so that you can make safe gear decisions but not overpack. But I have to admit, I've never really cared that much about the weight of my pack that I'm carrying. More often than not, I'm carrying a climbing rope, maybe a trad rack, mountaineering gear, skis. So when I'm actually just going hiking, my pack already feels pretty light and I don't really feel the need to go out and spend the extra cash on a backpack that's a couple of grams lighter. I kind of see ultralight hiking gear more as a luxury rather than a necessity. So I've just haven't stepped into that world yet. But if you guys watch the channel, you know that I'm pretty consistent on two things. A, getting strong and getting really prepared for the mountains, and B, not buying or promoting stuff that you just don't need. But I understand the element of ultralight hiking. It's exciting culling down your gear. It adds that little extra element that makes hiking interesting. So if you are exploring this concept, then I want to share some advice that might help you cull your gear safely. And obviously this is not a straightforward question. What you carry in your backpack will be determined ultimately by the circumstances of the hike that you're in. But I want to share these 5 questions with you that'll help you maybe make that decision process a little easier. And the first one is weather. So what are the typical weather patterns like in the area that you're going hiking? Is it likely that you get horizontal rain or a complete whiteout where you're going to need a GPS? Is it possible that there's going to be snow and snowdrift coming in underneath your tarp, and maybe you're better off taking a tent? I think that's probably the number one thing that's worth considering when you're going through your gear list. Number 2 is, what's your exit strategy? So having a look at the trail that you're hiking along, is there an opportunity for you to come out onto a road or get to a safe point if the weather does go really bonkers? Is there an exit point that you can get out of Dodge if things do get a little bit heckers? Number 3 is, how long is the trip? If this is a really long hike, then I recommend you maybe start out with a little heavier, because you can always donate things along the way, maybe send them home. And this is a great way of just figuring out really what it is you need. You can slim down on the trail. I think if you aim to be comfortable like 90% of the time, let's say you're going on a 100-day trip, then you're going to spend maybe 10 nights of those where you're a little bit outside of your comfort zone. But it's really those times where you learn the most and you kind of fortify yourself a little bit under those situations. Number 4 is considering who you're hiking with. How much experience do your fellow hikers have? And is it likely that you're going to end up in a kind of leadership role where you have to be holding the hand of that person a little bit? If that's the case, then I'd certainly recommend taking a few extra pieces of gear, maybe some extra safety items, just to make sure that you're prepared to give them a good experience. And obviously, if you're hiking on your own and you're a little bit more experienced, then you can certainly take the opportunity to take a few more risks and go a little bit lighter and just kind of challenge your own skills in the wilderness. And so much of being out in the wilderness is just building those skills and knowing where to camp, and obviously do your research, but so much can be learnt from just making mistakes. Number 5 is having a look at what services there are on the trail. Is there huts or refuges along the way that are going to be selling products, or are they just shelters that are unmanned? That's a really important thing to consider, especially when you start taking into account safety equipment. If there's a huge storm that comes through and you really need to bunker down for a day or 2 or more, having firstly shelter, but also communication to the outside world will be super important if that's the case. I think a lot of this comes down to how familiar you are with the trail that you're going on and who you're going with. For me, if I'm going back to an area that I know really well, where I know where all the campsites are, I know the water sources and the terrain, then I'm much more likely to slim down my kit, especially if I'm going alone. So if you're kind of ultralight curious like I am, a good way to test the waters is by repeating a trail that you know really well, and each time just try and cull down a little bit what you don't use or what you don't need. But obviously I'll leave it up to you to decide what you need, but I'm telling you, if your first hike is a through hike in Alaska, then now is probably not the right time to be going ultralight. And if you are new to hiking and you're a little bit apprehensive, then my advice is just to start small. You know, start with something that's 1 to 2 hours away from your house, just a short hike where you can gain some confidence. When I started hiking as a teenager in Tasmania, we would just take whatever gear that we had access to and we would go out and make mistakes and hope not to die. Before YouTube, people would just go out and make these errors and learn from them and build those skills. So, you know, obviously do your research, but making mistakes is one of the best ways to learn. That sort of stuff really sticks with you. Might be time for a new tent, guys. So now let's get into the gear itself. We're going to take a look at the typical ultralight gear list that maybe Kraig or someone like Jupiter Hikes would bring on an ultralight through hiking adventure. And I'm going to talk about maybe what I would add if I was in that situation. I want to preface this by saying that the hikers I'm referencing in this video, I have a huge amount of respect for, and this should not be taken as any kind of beef at all. Going ultralight and doing it well comes with a lot of practice and experience, and we all come from different backgrounds and experiences, so my aim here is only to point out the differences and show another perspective that hopefully you can learn from. So the first thing that I would change is probably base layers. I'm a huge fan of wool. It is a natural fiber. It stays warm when it's wet. It's antimicrobial, so you can wear it for 2 weeks and it doesn't smell. And they're really just a great backup plan. I think if you're heading into a cold environment, that's like the #1 thing to take, maybe that and a jacket. And speaking of jackets, I noticed that Jupiter Hikes, he has this super ultralight frog togs thing. I can't speak from experience, I've never had one of those, but they're like 20 bucks on Amazon, so I actually bought one the other day. So I'm gonna test it out and see how that goes. But most of the time, I'm taking a proper mountain hard shell. The one I have right now is from Cortazu, and I'm gonna test that out in a video coming soon. Another thing that crops up, I get a lot of questions about, is maps and GPS units. I typically bring a Magellan GPS unit if I'm going into true wilderness, but honestly, most of the time I'm pretty comfortable in the areas that I'm going to. In the past, I've used it in mainly Tasmania and New Zealand, situations where you're potentially going to be in a whiteout or there's no trail markers and you really need to know exactly where you are. But the one thing I'll point out with these ultralight through hiking guys is they do have GPS units, just happens to be on their phone, and you can download complete topos. You have a GPS unit even if you don't have actual reception, and it's just as good as a GPS unit in my opinion, as long as you can keep it charged. So it does take a little bit of learning and a little bit of I guess expertise and having the right apps and enough space for the topos, but essentially having a phone is a GPS unit. One thing that I have noticed from ultralight gear lists is there's a huge lack in the first aid department.
God is my first aid kit.
I guess coming from Australia, I'm used to taking a pretty huge first aid kit with snake bandages and antihistamines for all kinds of different insects. But what you tend to see on through hiking gear lists is just like Advil and some painkillers, and that would potentially worry me. I haven't hiked the PCT, but if I was going to, I'd probably be taking a pretty standard first aid kit. One thing that I would definitely be bringing is just your standard emergency blanket. That is always in my first aid kit. So I weigh nothing. I'm not sure why you don't see those on ultralight through hiking kit lists very often.
The heat is being conducted out of my backside.
When it comes to boots, I get lots of questions and lots of feedback about boots because I hardly ever wear hiking boots. I'm a trail runners kind of guy. I like to keep it nice and light. That's a huge topic in itself, so I'm going to make another video. I'll link it up here if you're interested in the whole kind of boot trail shoe discussion. And it's something that Kraig and I did talk about in depth on the podcast, so you can check that out as well. There's a link in the description. But you might by now have started to realize that I've kind of changed my tune on ultralight hiking, and there's been some things that have happened recently. I started getting into trail running, and I guess the most significant thing is that I decided to hike the GR11, and the GR11 is a 820 kilometer through hike from the Atlantic coast going all along the border of Spain and France through the Pyrenees. I'm doing that this September. I'm doing it solo and I'm going to be documenting it. So if you're interested in seeing those videos, then hit the subscribe button so you get notified when I post that stuff. But for now, if you want to dive in a little bit more detail into the boot discussion, I'm going to carry on that here in the next video. I'll see you on the summit.